Growing old does not guarantee peace. In fact, for many, it magnifies what was never resolved. But if you understand these four inner pillars, your later years can become the most meaningful chapter of your life. Why do some people become bitter with age, while others become calm, wise, and fulfilled? Stay with me, because the answer lies within what they built inside themselves long before old age arrived. Subscribe now if you want a peaceful old age. Like this video if this touched your soul. Comment, "I accept my life," if you feel this truth. Stay till the end. Something important is coming. There comes a time in life when the past is no longer something distant, no longer a series of fading memories that can be easily set aside. Instead, it becomes present, quietly, persistently present, woven into the fabric of one's daily awareness. In youth, the future dominates attention. There is movement, ambition, a sense that life is something to be shaped. But as the years pass, the direction begins to change. One does not only look forward anymore, one begins to look inward, and inevitably, backward. It is here that a crucial question emerges. What is your relationship with your own life? For many, this question is not easy to answer. The past is often approached with a mixture of pride and regret, of satisfaction and quiet disappointment. There are moments one wishes to relive, and others one wishes had never occurred. There are choices that feel aligned in retrospect, and others that seem like deviations from a path that might have been better. This tension creates an inner division. On one side, there is the life that was lived. On the other, the life that was imagined but never realized. And between these two, a silent conflict persists. To age peacefully, this conflict must be addressed, because the past does not dissolve simply because time has passed. It remains active within the psyche, influencing how one feels in the present. Unresolved regret can transform into bitterness. Unacknowledged pain can become quiet resentment. Even unfulfilled longing can linger, creating a sense that something essential was missed. These are not merely thoughts. They are emotional realities that shape one's inner state. To make peace with the past is not to deny these realities, nor to pretend that everything unfolded as it should have. It is something far more complex and far more honest. It is the process of understanding. Understanding that every decision was made within a particular state of awareness, that the person you were at that time did not possess the knowledge, the experience, or the perspective that you have now. It is easy, from the vantage point of later years, to judge earlier choices. But such judgment often lacks compassion, because it forgets context. It forgets the limitations, the uncertainties, the emotions that were present in those moments. To truly reconcile with the past, one must re-enter it, not physically, but psychologically. One must look at those earlier versions of oneself, not as mistakes to be corrected, but as necessary stages of development. Each action, even those that led to difficulty, contributed to the formation of who you are now. Without those experiences, you would not possess your current understanding. Without those missteps, you would not have gained your current insight. This does not mean that everything was right. It means that everything was part of a process that cannot be undone, only integrated. Integration is the key, because what is not integrated remains separate. It exists as a fragment disconnected from the whole, creating tension within the psyche. But when the past is accepted, not approved but accepted, it becomes part of a unified narrative. Your life becomes one story, not a series of contradictions. And within this story, even the difficult chapters hold meaning. There is also a deeper shift that occurs in this process. When one stops resisting the past, one stops resisting oneself. Because the past is not something external, it is part of your identity. To reject it is, in some way, to reject a part of who you are, and this rejection creates an ongoing internal struggle, a subtle but persistent discomfort that can never fully be resolved until acceptance is reached. Acceptance, however, is often misunderstood. It is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is an active acknowledgement of reality, a willingness to say, "This is what my life has been," not as a defeat, but as a recognition. And in this recognition, something softens. The need to rewrite the past fades. The need to compare one's life to what it could have been begins to dissolve. In its place there is a quiet sense of completion, not perfection, but completeness. And from this completeness, peace emerges. Because peace is not found in having lived a flawless life, it is found in having come to terms with the life that was lived. This is what allows old age to become something more than a continuation of unresolved tension. It transforms it into a space of reflection without regret, of memory without pain, of presence without the constant pull of what should have been different. When one makes peace with the past, the present becomes lighter, and the future, no matter how limited in time, becomes free of burden. Because there is nothing left to resist, nothing left to deny. Only a life that has been lived, fully acknowledged, fully accepted, and in that acceptance there is a quiet dignity, a stillness, a sense that, despite everything, your life was not something to escape from, but something to finally understand. There are parts of the human psyche that remain hidden, not because they are insignificant, but because they are difficult to face. These are the aspects of the self that do not align with the image one wishes to uphold, the impulses that feel uncomfortable, the emotions that seem unacceptable, the tendencies that contradict the identity carefully constructed over a lifetime. Rather than being acknowledged, these elements are often pushed aside, placed into the background of awareness where they can remain unseen. Yet what is unseen is not inactive. It continues to exist, shaping perception, influencing behavior, and guiding reactions in ways that are rarely recognized. This hidden dimension of the self does not disappear with time. In fact, as one grows older, it often becomes more pronounced, not because it has grown stronger, but because the structures used to suppress it have weakened. This is where the second pillar becomes essential, the integration of what has been hidden. In earlier stages of life, much energy is directed outward. There are roles to fulfill, responsibilities to manage, expectations to meet. The focus remains on what must be done, and there is little space to explore the deeper layers of the psyche. When uncomfortable thoughts or emotions arise, they are often set aside in favor of maintaining stability and function. But as life progresses, this outward focus begins to soften. There is more space that invites reflection. And within this space, what was once hidden begins to surface. For some, this emergence is unsettling. They encounter parts of themselves they do not fully recognize or perhaps have long avoided. Feelings of resentment, regret, jealousy, fear, emotions that contradict the image of who they believe themselves to be. There may also be unrealized desires, aspects of identity that were never expressed, potentials that were left unexplored. These elements can create discomfort because they challenge the coherence of the self. They introduce contradiction, complexity, and ambiguity into a narrative that may have once felt stable. It becomes clear that one is not defined solely by their strengths, their virtues, or their conscious intentions. There is more beneath the surface, and this realization requires a shift. To reject these aspects is to deepen the division within the self. It is to maintain the illusion of wholeness while remaining internally fragmented. But to acknowledge them, to bring them into awareness, is to begin the process of integration. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse or embracing every tendency without discernment. It means recognizing their existence, understanding their origin, seeing how they have influenced one's life, and allowing them to become part of a larger, more complete picture of the self. This process requires honesty, a kind of honesty that is not concerned with judgment, but with truth. It asks, what have I avoided within myself? What have I denied? What have I chosen not to see? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary, because what remains hidden continues to operate in the background, often in ways that are disruptive. Unacknowledged anger may appear as irritability. Unrecognized fear may manifest as control. Suppressed desires may lead to restlessness or dissatisfaction. Without awareness, these patterns repeat. With awareness, they can be understood. And once understood, they can be integrated. Integration brings a different kind of stability, not the stability of control, but the stability of wholeness. A person who has faced their inner contradictions is less divided, less reactive, less driven by unconscious forces. They no longer need to maintain a rigid image, because they have accepted that they are complex, multifaceted, and, at times, contradictory. This acceptance reduces inner conflict. It creates space for self-compassion, because one no longer expects perfection. One expects truth. In later life, this becomes particularly important, because without integration, the hidden aspects of the self can become more pronounced. They may surface as bitterness, as unresolved tension, as a sense that something within remains unsettled. The individual may not fully understand the source of this discomfort, but it persists nonetheless. Integration transforms this experience. It allows the individual to look back on their life with greater clarity, to see not only what was visible, but what operated beneath the surface. It brings a sense of completion, not because everything was ideal, but because everything has been acknowledged. There is also a quiet liberation in this process, to no longer hide from oneself, to no longer maintain an internal separation between what is accepted and what is denied, to exist as a whole being, rather than a divided one. This wholeness does not remove difficulty, but it changes one's relationship to it. It replaces avoidance with understanding. It replaces judgment with awareness. And in doing so, it creates a deeper sense of peace. Because peace is not found in presenting only the best parts of oneself. It is found in accepting the entirety of who one is. Light and shadow, strength and weakness, clarity and confusion, all held within a single integrated self. And in that integration, there is a quiet strength, a grounded presence, a sense that nothing within needs to be hidden anymore, because everything has been seen, understood, and finally accepted. There comes a moment in life when the structures that once defined identity begin to lose their weight. The roles that once felt essential, professional titles, social positions, achievements carefully built over decades, gradually loosen their hold. What once answered the question, "Who am I?" begins to fall silent. And in that silence, a deeper and more unsettling question emerges. Who am I without what I have done? In earlier years, meaning is often intertwined with action. One moves through life with purpose directed outward, building, creating, striving, achieving. These efforts are not without value. They provide direction, structure, and a sense of contribution. They shape one's place in the world and offer a framework through which identity is understood. But these external markers are not permanent. Time alters them. Careers come to an end. Responsibilities shift. Recognition fades. The world that once demanded your constant engagement begins to require less of you. And while this transition may appear as a form of loss, it is, in truth, an invitation to discover a different kind of meaning, one that is not dependent on what you do, but rooted in what you understand. For many, this transition is difficult, because when meaning has been tied primarily to external achievement, its absence can feel like emptiness. There is a sense of disorientation, as though the ground beneath one's identity has shifted. The question arises, if I am no longer defined by my roles, what remains? What remains is the inner life. But the inner life is often unfamiliar territory. It is not structured in the same way as external pursuits. It does not provide immediate feedback or clear milestones. It requires a different kind of attention, one that is reflective rather than active, inward rather than outward. To cultivate meaning at this stage is to turn toward this inner life. It is to begin asking questions not about what has been accomplished, but about what has been learned. Not about how one has been seen, but about how one has seen. It is a shift from performance to perception, from achievement to understanding. This shift does not happen automatically. It requires a willingness to let go of previous definitions of success, to release the idea that one's value is determined by productivity or recognition. to accept that meaning can exist without constant activity, that fulfillment can arise not from doing more but from seeing more clearly. There is a quiet depth in this realization, because when meaning is no longer tied to external validation, it becomes more stable. It is no longer subject to change based on circumstance. It does not diminish when roles change or when achievements are no longer at the forefront. It becomes internal, something that accompanies you regardless of what is happening outside. This internal meaning often emerges through reflection, through looking back on one's life not with judgment but with curiosity, through recognizing patterns, understanding choices and seeing how experiences, both positive and difficult, have contributed to one's development. It is in this process that life begins to feel coherent, not as a series of disconnected events, but as a narrative with depth and significance. There is also meaning found in connection, not necessarily in the broad sense of social engagement but in the quality of interaction, in the ability to be present with others without the need to prove or achieve, in the quiet exchanges that carry understanding rather than expectation. These connections are often deeper, more authentic, because they are no longer influenced by external roles, and there is meaning in simply being, in observing, in appreciating, in existing without the constant need to move towards something else. This may seem unfamiliar at first, especially for those who have spent much of their lives in motion. But over time, it reveals a different kind of richness, a richness that is not measured by accumulation, but by awareness. This does not mean that action ceases to have value. It means that action is no longer the sole source of meaning. It becomes one aspect of a broader experience rather than the foundation of identity itself. In this way, later life can become a period of profound depth. Not because it adds more to one's external story, but because it allows for a deeper understanding of that story. It provides the space to see life as a whole, to integrate its experiences, and to find meaning not in isolated achievements, but in the totality of what has been lived. Without this shift, there is a risk of clinging to past roles, of seeking validation in ways that no longer align with one's stage of life, of feeling diminished when external recognition fades. This can lead to frustration, to a sense of irrelevance, to the belief that something essential has been lost. But when meaning is cultivated from within, nothing essential is lost. It is transformed. The focus moves from what was done to what was understood, from what was achieved to what was realized. And in that realization, there is a quiet fulfillment, a sense that life, in all its complexity, has not merely been lived, but has been deeply and meaningfully understood. There is a quiet shift that occurs as life advances, a gradual movement away from constant activity toward increasing stillness. The world, once filled with demands, voices, obligations, and motion, begins to soften. The spaces between moments grow wider. There is more time, more silence, more distance from the noise that once defined everyday existence. For some, this transition feels like relief. For others, it feels like emptiness. The difference does not lie in the external world, but in one's relationship with solitude. Solitude is often misunderstood. It is commonly associated with absence of people, absence of interaction, absence of stimulation, and when it is experienced in this way, it can feel like loneliness, like a void that needs to be filled. But solitude, in its deeper sense, is not about absence. It is about presence, the presence of oneself without distraction. Throughout much of life, people rarely encounter themselves in this way. There is always something to attend to, something to respond to, something to occupy attention. The external world provides a constant stream of engagement, and within that stream, one can move without ever turning inward for extended periods. This movement becomes habitual, so much so that when the external activity begins to slow, the internal world feels unfamiliar. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Stillness feels unnatural. Thoughts that were once easily avoided begin to surface. Emotions that were set aside begin to make themselves known. This is often where solitude is mistaken for loneliness, because what is being encountered is not merely the absence of others, but the presence of the self, unfiltered, uninterrupted, and at times unexamined. To be alone in this way requires a different kind of capacity. It requires the ability to sit with one's own thoughts without immediately seeking escape, to allow memories to arise without resisting them, to experience emotions without needing to distract oneself from them. This is not always easy, particularly for those who have spent years avoiding such encounters. But within this challenge lies an opportunity, because when one learns to remain present with oneself, something begins to change. The discomfort gradually lessens, the unfamiliar becomes familiar, and what once felt like emptiness begins to reveal depth. There is a kind of richness in solitude that cannot be accessed through constant interaction. It allows for reflection, for observation, for a deeper engagement with one's own inner life. Without the noise of external demands, one can begin to notice patterns of thought, of feeling, of perception, that were previously obscured. This awareness brings clarity, not all at once, but gradually. It allows one to see oneself more fully, not just the parts that are easily expressed in social contexts, but the quieter aspects that exist beneath the surface. There is a kind of honesty in solitude that is difficult to achieve elsewhere. And with this honesty comes a sense of grounding. Because when one becomes familiar with oneself, there is less need to seek constant validation from the outside. There is less dependence on external interaction to create a sense of identity or worth. One's presence becomes sufficient. This is where solitude transforms. It is no longer something to be endured. It becomes something to be valued. A space where one can exist without pressure, without expectation, without the need to perform. A space where one can simply be, without needing to become something else. In later life, this capacity becomes essential. Because the external world naturally becomes quieter. Social circles may change. Activity may decrease. There is less distraction, more stillness. Without the ability to be at ease in solitude, this stage can feel isolating. But with this ability, it becomes peaceful. It becomes a time of depth, of reflection, of quiet fulfillment. There is also a subtle shift in how one relates to time. In solitude, time is no longer something to be filled, but something to be experienced. Moments are not rushed through or occupied for the sake of avoiding stillness. They are allowed to unfold at their own pace. This creates a different rhythm, one that is slower but more intentional. And within this rhythm there is a kind of freedom. Freedom from constant comparison. Freedom from the need to keep up. Freedom from the pressure to remain externally engaged at all times. This freedom does not lead to withdrawal from life. It leads to a deeper participation in it. Because when one is no longer overwhelmed by external noise, one can engage more meaningfully with what remains. Interactions become more intentional, experiences become more vivid. Even simple moments carry a greater sense of presence. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It requires a willingness to enter solitude, rather than avoid it, to see it not as something lacking, but as something containing, to recognize that within the quiet, there is not emptiness, but possibility. The possibility of knowing oneself more deeply, of reconciling with one's own thoughts, of finding a sense of peace that is not dependent on constant activity or external connection. In the end, solitude is not the absence of life. It is a different form of it, one that is quieter, slower, but no less meaningful. And for those who learn to embrace it, it becomes not a source of loneliness, but a sanctuary, a place where one can rest, reflect, and finally feel at home within oneself.